Hello and welcome. My name is Richard Stember, and I'm the Executive Director of Science Heads and a volunteer with NASA. Today, I'm joined by Spencer Murray. Like me, Spence is a chemist and has been an amateur astronomer for many years. He's also a volunteer with the Orange County Astronomers and has participated in literally hundreds of outreach events at local schools, libraries, and other public venues. Our star party tonight is titled Introduction to Using a Telescope. It's meant to help people who just bought their first telescope or have dusted one off that has been used for a while. Today we will focus on ways to avoid the kind of frustrations that new amateur astronomers face in the beginning. During this event, you are welcome to enter questions into the GoToWebinar question panel. We'll do our best to answer all of your questions either during or after the event. And for you kids out there, please let us know what grade you're in. Before I start, I want to tell you a bit about our organization. Science Heads is a 501c3 nonprofit whose mission is to promote and support STEM education. We host educational events at schools and public venues, and we are a member of the NASA Museum Alliance. Our volunteers love science, technology, engineering, and math, and if you do too, I invite you to check out our website at scienceheads.org. So as I mentioned, the slides that we're using tonight are available in the handouts panel for you to download, along with some other useful PDFs. This video and those handouts will also be posted to our website, scienceheads.org. If you pull down the menu for programs, you'll see a link there for star parties, virtual star parties. Click on that link and you'll see a complete listing of all the star parties that we're offering, particularly during this pandemic period. So with that out of the way, we can get started. Hey Spence, here's a picture that you took of the Milky Way. It's really incredible. It's beautiful. Can you tell us what we're seeing?
Yeah, thank you, Richard, and thank you for the introduction. Hello, everyone. I chose this image because I think it really emphasizes the virtually hundreds of objects that you can see in the night sky. Some are easily seen without the aid of binoculars or telescopes. Others are much more dim, and you have to get dark sky areas to really enjoy them. But I'd like to just talk about a couple of the objects in here that are easily visible with the naked eye. And Richard, if you were to look in the upper right-hand corner, there's a very bright dot there where your marker is. That's actually the planet Jupiter. If you were to go to the lower left-hand side, another bright dot over there, that is the planet Saturn. So two very exciting, two of the most, I think, exciting targets to look at. Right now, they're actually going out of the evening sky, so we won't be seeing them again for a few months. In the band of the Milky Way, if you look very closely, you can see a little bit of color in this directly between the two planets. That is actually a nebula. Under good conditions, you can actually see that with your naked eye. That particular nebula is called the Lagoon Nebula. If you look a little closer up on the top left, there are two very small nebulas. Those you would need to have a pair of binoculars or a telescope to see. One of them is called the Swan Nebula. The other is called the Eagle Nebula. So I thought this would be a good way to introduce the sky and the multitude of things that you can see there. Richard, I think maybe a good way to get started here is if you would tell us a little bit about the types of mounts and how they're used.
Sure thing, Spence. So in this slide here, I've listed some basics, like the different types of telescopes. There's manual versus motorized telescopes. You refer to them as push-to and go-to. There's different types of optics, refractor, and reflector are the two types of optics. Refractor telescopes use lenses, and reflector telescopes use primarily mirrors. Some of them use both mirrors and lenses. And then there's two basic types of mounts. There's the Alt-Az mount and the Equatorial Mount. Alt-Az is short for altitude and azimuth. And we see that in the telescope diagram at the top there on the right. It has two axes of movement, and we'll talk about how that type of mount, as well as the equatorial mount, moves and how that relates to navigating the night sky. So if we first start thinking about navigating the sky with an Alt-Az type of mount, you can see this cartoon person is standing on the surface of the Earth there, a flat surface, and it's like they're in the middle of a compass, isn't it? They're facing north. Behind them is south, to their right is east, and to their left is west. And you can see also altitude and azimuth is marked on this diagram. If the person rotates on their feet, they'll be moving in the azimuth plane, and if they raise their head and look higher up in the sky, they're moving their head in the altitude plane or axis. So if they want to look at that star, they'll face it and then look up, and they'll see that star that's on the diagram. And that's the basics of how an Alt-Az mount works. There's basically two axes on a Alt-Az type of mount. One axis rotates the optical tube on the azimuth plane. Think of it as like a compass. You could face it north or south or east or west. And the other axis raises the tube in altitude, so you could point it at that star, which is in this diagram here, roughly halfway up the sky. So it's really handy when using an Alt-Az mount to have a compass. And when we get to our checklist later, Spence, I think you've included this as an item to bring with you, because the compass tells you which way you're facing. It may not be really apparent to you which way is north. Well, the compass will tell you that. But also look closely at that compass that is in this diagram. Notice that it's divided up into degrees, and these are called the azimuth degrees, or another word for it would be heading. So north is 0, and east is 90, and south is 180. And there's increments in between as well, and that's very useful information. When we start talking tonight about target lists, we'll share with you how to look up the azimuth setting of an object that you want to look at, a target for your telescope. Altitude is also important, of course, and I'm going to give you a little hint here about how to quickly measure altitude. It turns out that your hand extended at arm's length can be used to roughly measure the night sky, or the daytime sky for that matter. A pinky is roughly 1 degree. 3 fingers, like in a Boy Scout salute, is 5 degrees. A fist held out at arm's length is 10 degrees, and rabbit ears with two fingers up, like indicated there, is 15, and a surfer dude sign is a full 25 degrees. So as indicated there, the Big Dipper is approximately 25 degrees in width. So if you know a certain object is in let's say 240 degrees azimuth and about 10 degrees above the horizon, even if it's daytime, you'll be able to estimate where it's going to appear when night falls. Now, an equatorial mount is a little bit different, but not so different. It really just moves one of the axes so that it is aligned with the imaginary axis of the Earth, which goes through the North Pole and the South Pole. So imagine tilting that Alt-Az telescope. So one of the axes is now pointing up into the sky. In fact, if you have a telescope that looks kind of like this, that's what it's doing. You can see one axis is pointing towards polar north. Now, in the northern hemisphere, the North Star or Polaris is roughly at the on the northern axis, the polar axis. So an equatorial mount typically gets aligned first to the North Star, the Polaris. And the benefit there is because the Earth rotates around that imaginary axis, the user of an equatorial mount only has to make one adjustment to track an object. So as the night progresses, the sky is rotating on that polar axis. If you're looking at an object for a long period of time, you only have to adjust one axis so it stays on that particular target. It makes it very convenient when tracking objects for a long time. So, Spence, with that explanation out of the way, what are the most important things to address when first getting started in astronomy?
Well, Richard, I think the three best pieces of advice I can give anyone are the three that are appearing now. Plan ahead, and plan ahead. If you've been at this a while, I'm sure you've run into situations where you've forgotten something or you don't have the information you want. So planning ahead is very, very important. Of course, that means many different things. It depends on the type of tripod that you have. It depends on the scope that you have. It depends a little bit on the experience that you have.
So let's say you have a new scope. How would you proceed?
Okay, so with a new scope, again, there's that word plan. I say make sure you plan sufficient time at your home to become familiar with your new setup, both the tripod and the telescope itself. And the goal here is you almost want to reach a point where you can assemble and operate your system in the dark, because obviously you're going to be facing that when you go out at night. So to not get too bogged down, I do recommend reading the manual, but not to get too bogged down. Manufacturers put a lot of information in the manuals. When you're just getting started, a lot of that can be a little confusing and not really relevant to what you want to do. So my suggestion there is to just read through the assembly and then read through the operation. So Richard, as you mentioned, if you have a manual mount, it can either be, which I call a push to, it can either be an Alt-Az mount or an equatorial mount. The important thing in terms of operation there is that in the image on the bottom, you can see there are some thumb wheels that are sticking out from the mount itself. Those thumb wheels, when you turn them, operate the scope in the altitude and the azimuth direction. It's very important at night that you know which knob to turn to make your telescope go in which direction. The reason I say that is because your scope is not tracking your target. And so if you look away for a minute or you get distracted, that target can easily move out of your field of view. And if you don't know which way to move your scope, it can be very frustrating trying to find it again. So just become familiar with the knobs on your manual or push-to mounts. Motorized mounts, again, Richard, as you mentioned, operate the same way in terms of how they scan the sky. The difference is they're driven by motors instead of by your hands. So motorized mounts usually come with a hand controller. Once again, the hand controller has a lot of buttons on it. So the advice there is to become familiar with just the buttons that you need to get started to operate your manual for your device. So the best way to do that, I think, is to practice what I would call false alignments. It's very easy outdoors in your backyard or even in your house. You can trick the scope, if it's a motorized scope, to set it up so that it thinks it's looking at particular targets, and then you can tell it to go to a target and see whether it operates the way that it should.
Spence, what about eyepieces?
Well, Richard, that's a very good question as well. I think the point that I'd like to make here is that when you're first starting out, you want to begin with what we call a large field of view. So a field of view, simply defined, is the piece of sky that you're able to see when you look through your eyepiece connected to your telescope. And that field of view is related to a number that's printed on the eyepiece. And the larger the number, the larger the field of view. So in the examples below, if you look at the eyepiece on the left, that happens to be, I think that's a 35 millimeter eyepiece. The circle just to the right of that tells you about what the moon would look like if you use that eyepiece. The lens on the right-hand side is a 4, I think, millimeter lens. So you get much higher magnification out of that. And you would see approximately what the picture on the left of that lens shows you. So you can imagine, the reason we bring this up is you can imagine if you start with a high-powered lens, a low number, it's going to be very difficult to find your target. And when you find it, it's likely to creep out of the way before you get set up or before you get aligned. So the bottom line here is start with a higher number, the highest number that you have. Manufacturers typically supply eyepieces with their scopes. They run anywhere from, I would say, 25 millimeters up to 35 millimeters. Grab that one first. When you get set on your target, if you'd like to, then you can easily pull your eyepiece out and stick in one that gives you a higher magnification. So use the smaller number later.
So let's say we've practiced inside during the day when we feel real comfortable manually or automatically operating the telescope, and we've grabbed the right eyepieces. What else should we consider before heading out?
Okay, another very good question, Richard. I've sort of divided this question up into three areas. The first, and I think one of the most important things, is compile a checklist. You don't want to show up in the field and realize that you've forgotten something that you absolutely have to be able to view the sky. So I would compile a checklist. I've listed a few items here. The first one is a target list. And you can make your target list very simple. If you pick out 3 or 4 targets that you want to look at, just write down the name of the target and the Alt-as coordinates. The other important part of that is you want to write the coordinates down for the time that you're going to be observing that particular target. So if you have that list and you have a compass and you have your hand, you can very easily determine approximately where that object's going to be at a given time. The other thing that's important is to bring a red headlamp or flashlight. And the reason for that is so that you do not compromise your night vision. I think Richard will talk a little more about that.
Right.
The thing is, you don't want to run out of power. Many things operate off of power, especially when you're out in the field. Headlamps run off power, flashlights. Some telescopes operate off of batteries themselves that are internal. If you have a go-to scope, you're probably going to need what's called a power tank. And those are the 4, I think, that are very important. Now, as Richard mentioned, you mentioned earlier, we put together a much longer checklist than that, and that's located in the handout section, so please feel free to download that.
Oops, there we go.
So the next thing you're going to want to know is what are the weather conditions. The atmospheric conditions are usually the limiting factor in how well you're going to be able to see when you go out. So it's useful to look up some of the more common weather forecasting sites, places like weather.com or Weather Underground, and those have some very, very useful information. But there's a site that I use quite a bit that's specifically designed for astronomy. It's called Clear Dark Sky. And as you can see, there are a lot of squares and there are a lot of colors on the chart that I downloaded before. Some of that is available on the standard weather forecast, but there's very interesting information that's in there that's going to tell you exactly what's going on when you're going to be at your site. So things like transparency, seeing, smoke, wind, those don't show up under normal weather forecasting conditions, but they're very important. In fact, you may look at this list, and you can obviously input the site that you're going to be at, input this list and decide it's not worth going out at all. Nothing worse than getting to where you want to go and finding out that you haven't checked the conditions. So with things like wind and temperature, I think that leads me to my next point, and that is dress for the weather. The best thing I've found to make your night more comfortable if it's cold is hand and toe warmers. And I don't know if any of you have used those before or not. They're small little packets that the hand ones just fit in the palm of your hands. They're activated by air, and they last 6 to 8 hours. And there's nothing better than putting those in the pockets of your jacket. You're going to have to use your hands quite a bit to manipulate your scope. They're going to get cold. Nothing more satisfying than sticking your hands in those pockets with those hand warmers. It's a great feeling. And also, since you're contacting a cold ground, they also have toe warmers. And the other obvious thing is to dress appropriately for the weather. Layer your clothing. So I think with that, that covers, I think, what you would need to at least go out into the field. Richard, beyond that, I think you have some suggestions for some actual targets and how to find them.
I do, Spence. So that would be the maybe the next step is decide what you're going to look at. And particularly if you're a beginner, one of the best things to look at in the beginning is the moon. The moon is an incredible object. It's beautiful to look at through even a small telescope. But not every night is going to be a great night for looking at the moon. In fact, you don't want to try to look at the moon when it's full, when it's completely illuminated. It'll be just too bright to actually look at. It literally hurts my eyes when I try to look at it when it's full. Now, the best time to look at the moon is just before or after the first quarter. So today is January 8th. So in a little more than a week, we'll be getting closer to the first quarter, which is on the 20th. And during the crescent periods of the moon, well, that's the best time to look at it through a telescope. You'll see shadows. You'll see shadows of mountains and ridges and craters. You'll see a lot more detail. It's a lot more fun to look at the moon when it's a crescent. Certainly much more so than when it's full. And obviously, you want to avoid nights where it's a new moon if you're going to look at the moon, because on a new moon, like on January 13th coming up next week, it's not illuminated at all, and it'd be very hard to see. So I've circled some dates coming up, which would be a great time to look at the moon with your telescope. It's always a beautiful object to look at. And I think, Spence, a little bit later on, you're going to make a recommendation in terms of alignment. So the moon may be the first target that you look at each night that you go out. Another way of coming up with a target list, or a good way of coming up with a target list, is to use Planetarium software. There's a lot of great and even free Planetarium software available for PCs and Macs, even iPhones and Android phones. And this is a great way of putting together a target list that you're going to use for your observations. It'll give you all the information that you need to find that object. Now, I've got an example here using one of my favorite planetarium software. It's called K-Stars. And again, it's a free application. And here's what it looks like. Before you use any planetarium software, there's 3 pieces of information that you have to input, which is really critical to be able to use it. You need to input the current date, and you need to input the time that you're going to be observing. So the date and time that you're going to be observing with your telescope, that's very important. The third critical piece of information is your location, because obviously the night sky will look different than in Saudi Arabia than it does in Irvine, California. And a lot of the software defaults to, some location around the world. So be sure to set your location, the date and time that you're going to be observing. And then the planetarium software will display a virtual version of the night sky at that time that you specified. So we see a pop-up there with the calendar, and below that is the time. And circled there in red is where the moon is going to be at that point in time. Now, obviously, it's really easy to find the moon. You don't need to know any real details about it. But there's a lot of objects which are hard to find. They're very, very small, kind of obscure. So I'm just using the moon as an example here. If you right-click on the object that you want to look at, with K-Stars, another pop-up will appear, and there's a tab there for details. And in the details section, it will list both the azimuth and the altitude of that target at that time. So this is important information. You'll want to write this down, because you're going to get to your observing site probably before the sun sets. It's still going to be bright outside, but you're going to want to know where the objects are, the targets that are in the sky that you're going to be looking at when it does get dark. And how will you be able to translate that into the sky when it's still light? Well, remember, bring a compass. And that compass will give you the azimuth setting, so you'll know which way to face. And your hands, which you always have a hand with you, hopefully, you can use to measure the altitude that you expect. And Spence will review this with you. It's kind of a critical part of setting up. Now, another way of looking for objects is just scanning around with the planetarium software. So I'm going to drag on here K-Stars. This is the software running on my computer here, and roughly this time and this date. And just simply by dragging my mouse around, I can see what objects are up in the sky, if there's any planets, what constellations are up there. And if I keep on dragging this around, we're going to see the moon listed, and we'll see other objects listed as well. Now, this is a great way of building your target list. You right-click on it, look up the Alt as coordinates for that object at that particular time. Now, I'm going to give you another great object for the beginner to observe with their telescope. It's the Orion Nebula. I think most of you probably will recognize the constellation Orion. It's easily recognizable by the 3 stars that make up its belt. But with your planetarium software, you can click on search, and it will center on the target that you searched on. And if we zoom in here, I've done a search here for the Orion Nebula, and it's appearing in that green box there. And above it are those 3 stars that make up Orion's belt. The nebula is in what we call the sword, which hangs down from this mythical hunter's belt. And in the middle of that belt is the Orion Nebula. It's really easy to find, even in a small telescope. Just look for those 3 stars and look for the dimmer stars that are hanging down from the belt. A great object to look at in the beginning. I love looking at the Orion Nebula. Spence, I think you've created a beginner's list that we've uploaded to the handouts panel, haven't you?
Yes, actually, Richard, I came up with a list that basically describes about a dozen or so, I think, of the most popular objects to look at in the sky. So when you download it, you'll see that there's a description of name of it. The planets are on there. Some of the nebula are on there. There's about a dozen of them. Of course, you have to recognize they're not all up at the same time. So I've added a column in there that tells you approximately when you're going to be able to see those. And I thought that would be a good place to start. Most of those, half of those, I believe, are naked eye visible. The others you will have to use a telescope to find. So I thought that might be a useful starting point. But I have to say, you can easily get online, and depending on what time of year it is, we're in winter now, just punch in the 10 most popular objects in the wintertime, and you'll get your very own list. So please download it, check it off if you are able to find any of those things, and I'm sure once you get started, you're going to be able to find a lot more.
Great.
So let's get down to a practical thing that I tell people that look through my telescope, Richard, and that is, when you look through the scope, what can you actually expect to see?
That's a really good question, Spence. It's let's set some reasonable expectations here. I don't know what telescope our guests have purchased, but I'm pretty sure it's not the Hubble telescope. What I've done on this slide here is compared the type of image that you can expect to see through a typical amateur telescope, that's on the right-hand side of this slide, comparing that to an image from Hubble. With the Hubble telescope, which is in space, of course, it can capture a lot more information, a lot of color, and a lot more detail. There's no way that we can match that with an amateur telescope. But look at that beautiful black and white image on the right there. That is very typical of what you can expect to see when you point your telescope at the Orion Nebula. This is a birthplace of stars. It's actively forming new stars. I recommend that all of our guests read up on it. It's a really exciting part of our Milky Way galaxy. Another example of what you can expect to see through an amateur-sized telescope. Let's consider the planet Jupiter. The Hubble image, of course, is on the left there. We see a lot of detail, a lot of beautiful color, the great red spot. This must be a fairly old image because it's not as red anymore as that one, but you can see a lot of storms and a lot of clouds, a lot of detail. You're not going to see anywhere near that amount of detail through an amateur telescope, but you're going to see some amazing things. If you look at that image on the right, you do see some color in Jupiter. You see some cloud bands. That's fairly typical when the seeing conditions are good. And we actually, in this image, we see 4 of Jupiter's moons, the Galilean moons, and that's fairly typical as well. You're able to see 1 or more of the largest moons that Jupiter has. So through a small telescope, you can see some really beautiful stuff, some beautiful objects. It's just not going to be Hubble. So with that in mind, Spence, as we head outdoors, what do you think we should consider next?
Okay, first of all, Richard, I'd like to say that setting expectations is very valuable. You don't want somebody looking through your telescope that expects to see those pictures on the left when they see the pictures on the right. So I always tell them beforehand that set their expectations of what they're going to see. Okay, so let's move outside now. Let's say you want to go to a new location, leave the friendly confines of your backyard or a place near where you live. The first question is, why would you want to do that? And there's really two answers to that. The first one is that you're likely, well, first of all, we all live under a very large light dome in the urban areas where most of us live, and that interferes with the ability to see the sky. But even more local than that is your neighbors are going to have lights on. There may be street lights nearby. So light pollution around urban areas can be a real issue. The other thing is, if you're in your yard, for example, there are likely going to be obstructions. So you may not be able to see a lot of the sky. Obstructions are buildings, maybe your house, trees. And so getting to a new location takes care of those issues. You're going to have a much more successful night, I think, if you get into a darker area and you can see the entire sky. So having said that, I listed here, search for an open sky. That's 4 words, and it's very easy. Finding open sky that's going to be the type of sky you want is actually not very easy. Reason I say that is because, again, we live in urban areas. There are city parks, there are baseball fields and soccer fields that are large open expanses that give you a good view of the sky. First, in terms of city parks, as long as you're allowed to stay in city parks at night, they usually have lights on for your safety, and they usually have a time when you have to leave the park. So when you need to leave, say 10 o'clock at night, the lights go off, the sky is beautiful, but you can't stay. So the other way, and probably the most efficient way, is if you know anybody that has a telescope that's been doing this for a while, ask them. Can they give you any advice on where to go? Secondly, you can try looking on Google Maps. Look for green areas on the map. Look under the satellite view and see if there's anything nearby you that might work out. I would highly recommend, if you think you find a spot, go there the first time during the day and give a close-up look. If you see big light stanchions, if there are hills nearby, it may not be a good spot. So asking an astronomer who knows where to go is really the best way to go. Once you find that spot, don't rush. Arrive early. Allow yourself plenty of time to do what you need to do to set up for the evening. So I listed here select a viewing spot. What does that mean? So you're in a large open area. You have your target list with you, and it can be as simple as the target name and the alt-as coordinates. Walk around that viewing spot and find and use your hand and your compass to locate where your target is going to be at a particular time of night. And move around until you're in a spot where you can actually get a clear view of your target. Another thing that's a little more subtle but can cause a lot of trouble if you have a go-to mount, and that is some of these telescopes get to be pretty heavy. Mine is an 8-inch. I think it weighs about 60 or 65 pounds. You need to align those scopes. If you put them on ground that is soft, over time they're going to sink into the ground, and when you ask the scope to go to another target, it's not going to be able to find it. You'll need to go back and do your alignment all over again. So avoid soft spots. Freshly watered soccer fields or after a rain, you need to be a little bit careful. Never set up your scope on a beach. It's very tempting to do because there's nice dark areas, but highly recommend you do not do that. And then once you do all that, take the time, hopefully during daylight hours, where you can assemble your equipment and you can test your equipment.
What do you recommend that we look at first?
Yeah, Richard, I think we've covered that a little bit, but I'll add a little more to it. The moon, there's nothing easier than the moon. When the moon is up, it's really hard to miss the moon. So again, not only is the moon a very interesting target to look at, but it's also very easy to find. There's going to be nights when you're out where the moon might not be up, and you may do that on purpose. Then I try and find a naked eye target, something that's very easy to see. Planets that are up, bright stars, find those, and from there, and I'll show you in a minute how I would go about doing that, but from there, this is a good opportunity to align your finder scope. Now, we haven't talked much about finder scope. Finder scopes are basically small telescopes that are mounted on your telescope tube. They have a very wide field of view. So they allow you to have a large enough view of the sky that it's fairly easy to find a naked eye target. But the important thing is that that finder scope has to be looking at the same spot that your telescope is looking. So to align your finder scope, my recommendation is look through your eyepiece at any object, look through your eyepiece, get that object in the middle or as close as you can to the middle of the eyepiece, go to your finder scope, and there'll be thumb wheels or adjustment capabilities on your finder scope. So you move your finder scope so it's seeing exactly the same thing that your telescope is seeing. I might add too, there's a number of reasons you want to know where the North Star is. One of the reasons is because it doesn't move. And things like aligning your finder scope, if you know where the North Star is, you can take all the time in the world to bounce back and forth between your eyepiece on your telescope and your finder scope, because that star is going to be in exactly the same spot. So that's one of the reasons I always, when I go to a new site, I always make sure that the North Star or Polaris is going to be visible to me. So let's talk a little bit about, we mentioned this many times, start with a wide field of view. It makes it much easier to find your target. The recommendation is an eyepiece that's maybe in the 20 to 35 millimeter range. Richard, you talked about this a little bit, but the recommendation here is if you find a target, you get focused, and you're under your wide field of view eyepiece, and you know where the Orion belt is, just move your telescope there if it's a push to. Locate the belt and sword, and even under fairly low power, you may get to be able to see exactly where the Orion Nebula is. Once you've got all that done, then pull your large field of view eyepiece out and increase the magnification up from there. Okay.
So summarizing then, you would suggest these steps, right, Spence?
Yeah, I call it honing in on your target. 3 of these we've talked about. One is something I find very useful that I'll bring up now. One is to get the biggest piece of sky that you can, use your alt as coordinates. That's going to put you in the neighborhood of your target. What I find very useful is get down and sight down your telescope tube. So you're looking exactly at what the telescope is looking at, and move it around until your target is resting right on the top of what you can see on your telescope. That's very easy to do. It will almost always bring you closer in field of view so that you're able to find your target in your finder scope, center the target in your finder scope, and then move on to your eyepiece.
So are there any additional pieces of equipment that you think would make viewing easier?
Actually, I have a list, and some of these may be useful to you. Some of these things you may already have, but here's a quick list. We talked a lot about looking at the moon. Richard, you mentioned that the moon is very bright. It actually does hurt your eyes. The object of a telescope is to collect as much light as possible. Full moon, you know, even with your naked eye, is pretty bright, but by the time you magnify that light, not only can it sort of cause you to tear up, but it can ruin your night vision. So moon filters are a necessity as far as I'm concerned. They generally come in 2 different transmissions. If you have a smaller scope, You could get one that lets 25% of the moonlight through. If you have like a 4 to 6 inch, if you have an 8 or 9 inch telescope, get one that allows only 13% of the light to come through. Not only does it preserve your vision, it also brings out a lot of relief on the surface of the moon. As you know, the moon is full of mare or lava beds that tend to be dark. The original basalt rocks there are light. Without a moon filter, you can hardly discern the difference between the two. So dim it down, you're going to have a much better viewing experience. And they're $10, $15. So as long as your eyepiece will accept one, you really need to do that. The other thing is, keep in mind that your telescope and all the accompanying equipment is fairly fragile. We'll talk about that a little bit later as well. It's going to arrive in a box. Boxes are fine if you're going out into the field for the first 10, 15, 20 times that you use them. Eventually, they're going to start to fall apart, and you're going to risk damaging your telescope. So there are a lot of telescope cases out there that your telescope will fit nicely into, that will survive any bumps or any damage externally. It's not going to hurt the scope on the inside. Well worth the investment if you're going out into the field often. The other thing is a lot of scopes already have this included, some don't. If you're looking through your telescope in the same line of sight as your telescope is looking, in other words, looking into the back of your telescope to look through your eyepiece, that works out pretty well as long as you're looking at a target that's fairly close to the horizon. But you end up looking at a target that's virtually over your head. There is no way you can crane your neck and get into a position that you can look through an eyepiece like that without causing yourself a little bit of pain. A diagonal directs that light 90 degrees, so you're looking out the side of the telescope. So no matter where you look, you're going to be able to look without having to crane your neck. Very important. The other thing that's a must-have is called a dew shield. Atmospheric conditions a lot of time will work against you. If you get the right combination of humidity and temperature, and particularly on nights when there's no wind, before you know it, the front of your telescope is going to start forming condensation. You can start out with a nice, bright, clear object. 15, 20 minutes later, you're wondering why it looks like it's under a puddle of water. Check the front of your scope, you probably have dew. So dew shields actually perform two functions. One is they keep the dew off of your telescope, and secondly, they limit any light that may be coming in from the side, a street light or somebody with a flashlight, so it doesn't impinge on your telescope and mess up your view. Additional to that, here are a few more things that are useful. These are a little more expensive, but I wouldn't go out without them. The same thing I described about the telescope, where you can get very awkward positions if you look straight through. Most finder scopes, and you may have noticed on the pictures or seen this have this on your own scope, most finder scopes are straight through. They're basically small telescopes. Once again, if you're looking at a very high angle altitude, it's difficult, to say the least, to be able to position your eye to look through that finder scope. So you can buy what's called a 90-degree finder scope that eliminates all of those issues. When I bought mine, it was a world of difference. The other thing, particularly for what I would call the motorized or go-to telescopes, you have to align them. And you have to align them by first getting your target in the center of your eyepiece, and then getting it in the center of, in the center of your finder scope, and then getting in the center of your eyepiece. That's actually a little harder to do than it might seem. So there are things called illuminated centering eyepieces. Basically, they have crosshairs in the middle of your viewing area that light up at night. So it's very easy to get your target dead center in the middle of your finder scope, dead center in the middle of your eyepiece. If you do both of those, which is also another good reason to be able to look at Polaris because it doesn't move, if you do that right, you're going to get a very exact alignment. And the entire rest of the night, for go-to telescopes. Anywhere you tell it to go, it's going to show up in your eyepiece. Another thing that's always a challenge, the last thing on my list, is what I call a fine focuser. Telescopes, most telescopes, when they're supplied, they have a fairly coarse focusing knob, and trying to get a good focus, in addition to all the other issues you have with focus, weather and dew and all the rest of it, to get a good focus, it's really hard to move that knob a little enough that you actually get a good focus. So the fine focuser that I have pictured here, you see the black knob near the top, that's what I call a coarse focuser, and that's what you're probably supplied with. The yellow or gold knob above that, you actually have to turn that 10 times around to make the coarse focuser move 1 revolution. So it's much, much easier to get good focusing with that. So that is the list that I've put together. I hope you find that useful. I think after that, Richard, if you would tell us what your ideas are of things that you have found to be especially helpful for beginners.
Sure, Spence. I've got a couple of suggestions, or a few suggestions here. It's not always possible to go out to a dark site. Sometimes you get the bug late in the evening and just want to, observe in your backyard. So if you're going to go outside, be sure to turn off all the lights, all the porch lights and the garage lights. And in fact, if there's light pouring out of windows from your house, turn off those lights inside your house. You want it as dark as possible outside. And in fact, you want your eyes to adapt to the darkness and allow 10 or 15 minutes for that dark adaptation to take place. If you do, you'll see so much more when you look through the telescope. It's pretty amazing how big your iris can get after letting some time pass. You can see pretty well in the darkness without any flashlights. But as you mentioned earlier, if you need a flashlight, be sure it's a red flashlight or a red headlamp. And another thing that throws a lot of light out is a cell phone. I know a lot of people like to use Planetarium software on their cell phones, and they're very handy and very easy to use. But I find, at least with my cell phone, it produces too much light. It interrupts with my dark eye adaptation. So instead of bringing your cell phone, consider getting what's pictured there on this slide. It's called a planisphere, and it has all the constellations and many targets, objects that particularly a beginner would love to see. We talked about the Orion Nebula, and we'll maybe talk about other nebulas and star clusters. You'll see them on that target list that Spence put together for you. It's all there on the planisphere. So if you've got a red flashlight and that planisphere, all you got to do is dial in the date and time, and you've got pretty much your own low-tech planetarium software without interrupting your dark adaptation. Now, when it comes to constellations, I suggest forgetting about all the animals and the people that they're supposed to represent. Instead, look for simple star patterns. We talked about the 3 stars that make up the belt of Orion. That's what I'm referring to. Look for those 3 stars. Just about everybody recognizes the Big Dipper. That's what we call an asterism. It's a part of a much larger constellation called Ursa Major. That's a very recognizable star pattern. So when you're using a planisphere or even a planetarium software, memorize those star patterns instead of trying to figure out the whole constellation or look for this person or this animal. Just look for the simple patterns. And here's something that goes against what we recommended a little bit earlier. Once you advance and start having the desire to look at much dimmer objects, what we call the dim and fuzzies, you're going to want to pick a moonless night. So don't try to combine lunar viewing with very dim object viewing. It's just not going to work. Pick a night where it's a new moon, or just a few days before the new moon, or just after the new moon. Again, the moon throws out a lot of light, and it'll ruin your dark adaptation. And you really want to maintain those dark adaptation of your eyes. Spence, before we wrap this up, do you have any other suggestions?
Richard, yes, I do. I put together a short list of what I found, again, to be very helpful. I mentioned this before. If you're just starting out, join an astronomy club. Clubs have all kinds of different resources that you can take advantage of. The local club that I belong to around here is called Orange County Astronomers. Of course, a lot of the resources are not available now, group gatherings, outreaches, but one of the things that Orange County Astronomers does is it conducts classes normally. The classes, one of the ones they conduct are for beginners, and although there are no classes going on now, they actually have all the literature that's used to go through those classes. That literature exists in PDF files. If you go on to the OCA website, you'll be able to access and download those PDF files. And Richard, I believe you put a link in at the end to allow people to go directly to those files.
Yes.
I think you find those very useful.
Mm-hmm.
Another thing we haven't talked about is collimation. Basically, collimation means that all the components inside your telescope are aligned properly. If they're not, you will not be able to focus. You'll get fuzzy views. So collimation is not terribly important on refractor telescopes. They're mainly just lenses, which are locked into place. They don't move. But the reflector telescopes, which I have a diagram over here on the right, it's an entirely different situation. They're mostly comprised of mirrors. And so you can see on this diagram, the light, if you can make it out, comes in from the left-hand side. It goes straight down the tube to those two pieces that are blue. That's actually a round mirror with a hole in the middle. That's called the primary mirror. That light then bounces back up to one in the middle of the tube, which is a secondary mirror, which then focuses the light on your eyepiece, so you get a nice crisp target. Bouncing reflector telescopes around will ruin your collimation. There are some places you can go to get them collimated, but you need to pay for that. Learn collimation. It's in your operating manual, and I would do it. Some people I know do it every time they take their telescope out. A good thing to know how to do. Another thing that I'm going to recommend, which might seem a little bit odd, is align your tripod, one of your tripod legs, with the target you're going to be looking at. Now you may ask yourself, why in the world would you do that? The reason is because the other two legs are now 120 degrees apart, and you stand in between those legs. So you won't be interrupted by a tripod leg sticking into your leg, or particularly if you have a small child that needs to get up on a stool. It's almost impossible if a tripod leg is right behind your view to be able to position a stool so somebody can look through it. So align your tripod leg with your target. Funny little hint, but I find it helps me. The other one is we talked multiple times about knowing where the North Star or Polaris is. I found on my scope and on most scopes, there's an area where the arm of your telescope and the tube of your telescope mesh, and they rotate next to each other. You can easily adjust your scope up to 34 degrees, mark those two spots on your arm and on your tube. And the reason I say to do that is because where we are in Southern California, the latitude is about 34 degrees for the North Star. The North Star actually is not very bright. There are going to be stars that you see long before you see the North Star. If you have an Equatorial Mount, you need to find the North Star. So if you mark your tube at 34 degrees, you're already taking away one of the degrees of freedom in finding the North Star. You don't have to go up and down in latitude. All you need to do is move your telescope back and forth. It makes it much easier to find the North Star. Mm-hmm. The other thing, and this is minor, but it made a world of difference when I started doing this, and that is, excuse me, Small telescopes have caps that fit over the end of the telescope, and the reason is that you want to protect that part of the telescope from dust and also for any potential damage. When you get into larger scopes, they're made out of, those tube caps are made out of plastic, and they only align one way. They have, they're indexed a lot like a lens that loads onto your camera. They only go in one way. If it's the end of a long, cold, wet night, you don't want to be moving your tube cap around trying to figure out where that alignment is. Put a piece of tape on your cap, put a piece of tape on your tube, and you can look up and you get, you know, to where you need to be in a second. So that's the end of my hints, Richard.
Oh, excellent list, Spence. That's going to help a lot of people, I'm sure. Now, we have mentioned quite a bit tonight, and I've put together some resource slides to share with you. So, of course, our website, scienceheads.org, at the top there, I've listed several different planetarium software packages that you can download for free, and the links to find that. And again, these slides are in the handout section, so be sure to download it or take a snapshot of this slide right now with your cell phone. Of course, if you want to load software on your iPhone or your Android phone, you'll want to go to either the Apple Store or the Google Play Store and do a search for Planetarium software or just Astronomy, and you'll find several packages available there. The other things that we mentioned, Spence, you mentioned the Orange County Astronomers Beginners class, and here's a link at the top there for those PDFs. As Spence mentioned, they're not offering these classes right now during the pandemic, but all of the course material is there in PDF form, so that's a great resource to learn more about how to use your telescope. I showed you a calendar of the moon, lunar calendar, and here's the website that I grabbed that calendar from, moongiant.com. Spence mentioned Clear Dark Sky for looking up the viewing conditions, the seeing and transparency and cloud cover, temperature and moisture, all those kinds of things you want to know about before you plan to go out. And as I recall, that gives you 2 days or 2 evenings in advance. So you can do a little planning in advance of your outing. There's another wonderful site called Heavens Above with a dash in between .com. And if you want to get more details about when planets are rising and setting and get Equatorial Mount settings for different objects, this is a great tool for that as well. So we highly recommend that. So we hope that that you've learned a lot today. We really appreciate you joining us, and these hints and suggestions that we've made can go a long way towards making the use of your telescope that much more enjoyable. So we want to thank you for attending. I want to remind you, we got another star party coming up on January 29th. We're going to be talking about viewing asteroids and comets using a telescope, and maybe even discovering some, which is not unheard of for amateur astronomers to discover new objects. You can register for this star party at the link that I've listed there. That link will also list all of the other star parties that we currently have scheduled, and we're going to be adding some more to that list for this period of time that we're in the pandemic. We'd love to see you at our future star parties. If you have any suggestions for topics that you'd like to see us cover, please just let us know. You can type into the question box right now. Spence and I will stick around for a few minutes answering any remaining questions that you may want to have. But thank you again for joining us. I really appreciate it. We appreciate your support for Science Heads. Spence, thank you so much for your role today. You provided some great information, and I really appreciate you taking the time tonight with me.
Sure, Richard. I enjoyed it.
So long, everybody. I hope to see you at another star party soon. Take care now.